Thin sheets of dough, layered to create flaky crusts for sweet and savory pies or pastries, is the ultimate indulgence. Brushed with butter or olive oil, each layer yields a light and crispy crust, adding texture and flavor to dishes like Greek spanakopita and baklava. While homemade phyllo dough is not the easiest dough to make, the effort required is rewarding in both flavor and accomplishment. I'm really excited to share my recipe along with many tips and techniques I've learned in making phyllo dough. Granted, you can't beat the convenience of a commercial brand, but the flavor of homemade can be just as satisfying. While most people don't make their own phyllo, and rightly so, if you're looking for a baking challenge, I encourage you to give it a try. Let's check out my recipe. For the ingredients, you'll need bread flour, salt, extra virgin olive oil, red wine vinegar or white vinegar or lemon juice, and water. While the ingredients are simple, making phyllo dough is all about technique. So we'll start by making the dough. So in the bowl of a large stand mixer, you're going to add 300 grams, which is 3 1/4 cups of bread flour. Now bread flour is needed in this recipe because it has a really high gluten content, and we need that gluten to develop, so to make the dough easier to stretch when we roll it out, since we need that dough so thin. Add 6 grams, which is 1 teaspoon of salt, and then we're just going to give it a quick stir to combine. With the dough hook attached, we're going to turn the machine on low, and we're going to add 100 milliliters, which is about 1/2 cup of extra virgin olive oil, and we're going to add it slowly. So olive oil gives flavor. It sustains moisture, since we're going to need it for the long duration of rolling out the dough, and it aids in stretching the dough when we roll it out. So now we're going to add 1 tablespoon of vinegar, and this is red wine vinegar. You could use apple cider, white lemon juice, as long as it has an acid. And we're going to add that slowly to our mixture. As in pie crust, acid tenderizes dough, making it pliable, and it also minimizes retraction when you're rolling it out. So we really need that acid in this recipe. Take a spatula and just scoop down that flour that's hanging out on the edge of the bowl. Now we're going to pour in 175 milliliters, which is about 3/4 cup of warm water. And this is lukewarm, so I like it to be around 100 degrees, just because it just helps keep that dough soft. The warm environment softens the dough, keeps it soft, and makes it, of course, easier to manipulate and encourages gluten development. Again, scoop down the flour that's hanging on the edges and at the bottom of your bowl. I'm going to turn the machine on medium speed, and I'm going to allow time for the water that I have poured in here to soak up into the flour. And we may need to add more water. It's going to depend on how humid your environment is or how dry it is. And I'll show you what mine looks like before I add anything else. If you still see flour hanging out the bottom or on the edges of the bowl, and your dough's a little crumbly, that means you probably should add a little bit more water. Add a tablespoon at a time. We're going to knead for 10 minutes. The dough should be tacky, not sticky, and should pull away from the bowl as it kneads, which is what mine is doing now. Take a look at this dough. I haven't added any more water than the initial 175 milliliters, and my dough, look how soft it is, thanks to the olive oil. And it's not sticky, but it has a nice little stretched tackiness to it. So this is just perfect for me. I don't need any more liquid, so I'm just gonna let it knead for 10 minutes. Our 10 minutes are up. Let's take a look at where we are. The dough hook has been moving the dough all around in that bowl. Look how nice and soft it is. Go ahead and mound your dough in the bottom of the bowl. And you can add some oil or spray. We just want to keep this dough moist. Spray it, put oil on your hands and add it to the bowl, and then just move it around so that the bowl and the dough are both greased. So we're going to cover the bowl with plastic wrap and or a towel. And we're just going to set this aside at room temperature on the counter for at least an hour, up to 2 hours. And there is no rising here because we have no yeast. So all we want this dough to do is to give time for the gluten to develop, because we really need those stretchy gluten fibers to roll this dough out as thin as possible. Let's go ahead and remove the dough from the bowl and place it on a work surface. And we're going to divide the dough into 12 equal pieces. You can eyeball it, but for this really thin sheets that we're gonna make, I prefer to weigh it. So just weigh your dough entirely, whatever the total weight is, divide it by 12, and that's how much your individual pieces should weigh. I have all 12 of my dough balls weighed out, and these were each about 56 to 57 grams. So all 12 I'm gonna put on a separate plate, and I'm gonna cover them so that they don't dry out with a towel and set them aside. So what I found useful in making phyllo dough, since it's so thin, it dries out very quickly from the air. So what I like to do is take a large cookie sheet. On it, place either some wax paper or parchment paper like so. And then I go ahead and cut 12 sheets of wax paper about the same size as my cookie sheet, because I'm gonna roll each of those 12 dough balls into about this shape, a 17 by 12. Now, the reason I do that is because here are some phyllo dough sheets that I actually made last week. And notice, because I have them separated by paper, that they don't stick to each other. Even though I coated them in flour before I stack them, they're separated by wax paper, they do not stick to each other. And it makes it so much easier when you want to separate them and use them in your dish. And then we're going to set the cookie sheet aside with the parchment paper. Flour well a work surface. And when I say well, I mean you really want to coat this surface well, because any sticking that occurs while you're rolling out your dough is going to make it crumple up and bunch up and fold over, and we don't want to do that. I just use regular all-purpose flour to roll out my dough. Okay, so then take one of your dough rounds and use the palm of your hand and just sort of flatten it out into more of a rectangle shape. The reason you use the palm of your hand for this is that if you start using your fingers, you're going to create thin sections. So as you're rolling them out, you'll have a thinner section in your dough. Another thing is you really want to use a rolling pin that has the same width of a roll here. And I do not mean one of these. A tapered rolling pin will not allow you equal pressure along the dough. We are looking for a consistently thin all around sheet of dough. You're going to try to keep a rectangle, and you want to make sure that your board stays floured and your pin stays floured. You're just going to roll out, and we're looking for a minimum of a 17 by 12 inch rectangle. If you can get it thinner than that, great. It's hard to get it much thinner than that, but that would be ideal. So as you're rolling, if you notice, like right here, I had a little bit of a fold right there. Let me see if I can see right there. There is a lift in the dough, and it's going to fold over. The reason that's there is because I have a sticky spot there. So to prevent those folds and clumps, about every couple of rolls, add flour to the bottom of your dough on your work surface. The folds occur when your dough cannot move as you are rolling it in a particular direction. So notice how easily it just rolls out as long as you have enough flour on your board. If you do get those wrinkles like this, you can either roll over it and continue to roll out the wrinkle, or stop, spread out your dough a little bit, like to flatten out that wrinkle, and then continue to roll. Okay, when you finish rolling out your sheet about as thin as you can get it, go ahead and dust it with flour, because we want to make sure that it doesn't stick. You want to keep it nice and dry. You can also do a combination of flour and cornstarch, and that would produce a finer grain to keep your dough covered and protected and keep it from sticking. I find flour works just fine, but I've also done a combination, 2 parts flour to 1 part cornstarch, then mix it up, cover both sides of your dough sheet. So then when you're finished, you can just lift it up. You're going to place it on wax paper or parchment paper on your cookie sheet. Now I finished one, so I stacked it. And don't worry if you get tears, because you're gonna have multiple sheets on whatever dish you're using anyway, and you can always save the tears for like a hidden dough. And you're gonna cover it with a sheet of wax paper, like so. And then I actually like to go back and put a damp towel. It's not wet, it's just a little damp, and it keeps the air out, and it keeps it a little bit moist so that our dough does not dry out as it sits while I'm stacking it. We just continue until we have all 12 of our dough balls in nice phyllo sheets. And then just make sure you put plenty of flour on. Flatten it out with your palm. Try to get a rectangle shape going at least. And then just start rolling it out. And flipping the dough over with each couple of rolls. So, keeping it flat and making sure it's consistent thickness throughout. Your dough should move as you roll. If it stops moving, that means you don't have enough flour underneath it. So notice how I can roll fast and my dough moves with my rolling pin on the surface. Take a look at my third one. Notice it's nice and rolled out. Notice how thin and flimsy it is. That's about as thin as I'm going to be able to get this by hand rolling it. But notice how easily it comes off of the board because we have all that flour on it. So it's easy to manipulate once you have plenty of flour, and then you don't have to worry about it tearing or crumpling or anything. That flour is so, so important. So we're going to add it to our stack. Add our sheet of wax paper, our damp towel, and continue. We're all done. All right, so take a look at our homemade version. So our homemade version, and it's very thin, but that's about as thin as you can get it when you're working with a rolling pin. Now I want to compare that to a store-bought phyllo dough, which is what you see right here. Notice how thin this sheet is. It's definitely thinner than the homemade one. This one definitely just looks like a sheet of paper. This one is thicker than a sheet of paper. Whenever the recipe calls for 2 sheets of phyllo dough, then just use 1 of homemade. If it says 4 sheets, then 2 sheets of homemade. So just keep that in mind. Every 1 homemade is equal to 2 to 3 sheets of commercial brand. But regardless, you're going to get a really flaky crust in your dish using homemade like you would with a phyllo that's store-bought. So notice all of my phyllo homemade sheets are separated by wax paper, and this just keeps it from sticking together. And we have, of course, 12 here, so that'd be comparable to 24 to 32 or so of a store-bought commercial brand. Now that the sheets are all rolled out, congratulations, you're done with the hard work. You can use the sheets immediately in your dish. If you want to store them, which is what I'm going to do, because I'm going to use these to make my spinach panna cotta. And so what I'm going to do is take the top 6 and I'm going to roll them up like so, just like you would see in a store-bought commercial box. Okay, and they're wrapped. And then I'm going to place one of them in a gallon-sized bag or larger if you have it, and then you want to seal it, okay? And then I'm gonna store mine in the refrigerator for up to a week like this. If you want longer storage, then you're gonna put it in the freezer and they'll last a couple months in the freezer. So these are too massive to place them all in 1 gallon-sized bag for the bag to seal, so that's why I'm dividing it up into 2 bags. And then it works just fine. So now your 2 bags of phyllo dough are ready to store in either the fridge or the freezer. If you want to put 1 in the fridge and 1 in the freezer because you want to use 1, which is equal to 12 sheets, now you could totally do that. But for longer storage, freezer for several months. Treat homemade phyllo dough just as you would the commercial brands. If frozen, thaw wrapped in the fridge and use as your recipe directs. Immediately have all your ingredients ready to go before you start to use these. See the recipe linked below in the description for lots of tips and techniques. I even provide you with a troubleshooting section for remedying potential issues you may encounter while rolling out your dough and just using the dough. I've already made lots of mistakes and learning, so I'm very happy to share those and resolutions with you. Homemade phyllo dough is an incredible baking challenge with amazing rewards. If using homemade phyllo dough, you'll need 1 homemade sheet for every 2 sheets of commercial phyllo dough, since homemade sheets are thicker than machine-made sheets. If you've made your own phyllo, please share your experiences and tips you've learned in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, liking, and subscribing. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, go bake the world.